Cool. Right, we're now on the other side. Right, hi, Brendan. Taken a while, but we're together. We're yeah. So just for people who are watching, whether this is live or recorded, doesn't really matter. Dr. Amy Redmond and I are writing a book about the digital transformation and innovation leadership within the real estate sector. We've done all of these interviews live so that you guys, can actually see the whole of the research that we put together in these books, whether it be from a venture perspective, whether it be from an industry perspective, or whether it be from a technology perspective. Ultimately, only a small, tiny part of interviews will make a book, and we want to make sure that you've got a bank of content that you can refer back to. So, Brendan, first and foremost, thanks so much for joining. It's great to have that sort of full picture of the venture cycle, because we've sort of looked at early stage funds and we're sort of coming to where you guys sit as well. So it's great to have you on board. So, I think as a starting point, it'd be great just to hear a little bit about sort of, the Brendan that perhaps some people know, and others may not. So just a short introduction would be great.
Sure. So I'm Brendan. I'm the co-founder and CEO of Fifth Wall. So Fifth Wall is should I talk more about Fifth Wall, or maybe my background? Are you interested in, James?
Well, I'll tell you what, I mean, people know Fifth Wall, but there was a post you put up the other day, which I really enjoyed, which was a picture of you with a baseball bat on backwards, of you. And I mean, I didn't know that journey of you, because I met you first at Future PropTech in London, right? Back in the early days when it was sort of going. And it was like Fifth Wall at the start, but I didn't know that bit of the Brendan journey. So talk to me about that. What were you doing?
Yeah, so I started my career. I was kind of lucky, I guess, early on, because I had a foot in real estate in my first two jobs, and then I worked in tech. So I graduated Princeton. I went to work in finance in real estate investment banking at Goldman Sachs, and then I did real estate private equity at Blackstone. So very early on, I got this kind of full throttle introduction to real estate finance, real estate capital markets. And that was basically during the bull cycle. So I started my career in 2004, and I went to business school in 2008. So I basically saw the end of that, cycle, which was a real estate capital market cycle. Then I went to business school at Stanford, which I think is where the video you're referencing was filmed. And I started a company totally outside of real estate. And the perspective I had at the time was that, real estate was not a very attractive sector to be in 2008, 2009. It was exactly where you wanted to have exited. And so I started a tech company that was in data and analytics, like totally outside of real estate. Started it as a student with a classmate. We literally started in a garage, like as Stanford students. It almost sounds like kind of a TV show.
It's like your textbook.
Exactly. It was like very textbook startup story. And we grew it, raised a bunch of money, and then we sold it. It was a great outcome in 2014, about 4 years later. So that was like the start of my interest and exposure to tech. And I think in the aftermath of that, I had this opportunity to kind of reflect on these two spheres that I have been fortunate to see both of, which is the world I came from, which is real estate finance and real estate capital markets, and then this world of tech. And my impression was that they were two spheres that didn't overlap. They didn't overlap ideologically. They didn't overlap with respect to people. And the reason I noticed this is that before I started Fifth Wall, I actually was thinking about joining a venture fund. And so a number of venture funds interviewed me to be a partner there. And as I was talking to them, they would ask me for ideas. They'd be like, "Oh, what are some spaces you'd be interested in investing in?" I kept saying, "Well, real estate's a large industry. It's 13% of US GDP. It's typically 10 to 20% of GDP in every market. Yep. This very slow and late adopting industry. It seems like a massive opportunity." And they were all kind of surprised by that. And I remember thinking in the aftermath of the interviews, like, I guess they don't really know the real estate industry that well. They were like surprised by the stat that real estate's the largest capital market on earth, that real estate is that big a percentage of GDP. And I think that kind of got my wheels turning of like, like there's all these venture investors, but for some reason, none of them have any experience having worked in real estate. And what would that imply? And it would imply exactly what you saw in the kind of pre-2017 era, which is that there wasn't a lot of venture investors who had worked in real estate. And I kind of had the ambition to be the first. And that's probably where the kernel of the idea started in my mind.
Yeah. So, I mean, let's go back to that, the sort of the foundation of because I suppose the interesting aspect for me was a bit of noise in the background.
Yeah.
We're back. So there's the interesting bit for me in the formation of Fifth Wall was arguably, whilst you weren't maybe the first venture fund, you were definitely the first of the what I call the later stage funds. And I think for me, when I'm looking at the research for the book, it's very much about understanding corporate attitudes to innovation. And I'm really interested in the discussions you were having at the time with those larger corporate companies who were willing to put money in the sort of first fund that Fifth Wall raised. I mean, how was that journey? Because I should imagine it wasn't easy for them to go, this is a great idea, we're going to give you some money for the first fund, given it's quite a late stage one. I mean, how was it for you?
Well, I mean, I don't know if it'd be helpful to give you even more of the backstory of like the kind of prehistory of Fifth Wall, but you know, Fifth Wall at one point was just me and Blackstone. So I actually went back to Blackstone and I talked to Blackstone before starting Fifth Wall because I saw they had just done this deal, the VTS deal. And I don't know if you remember that. That was like 2014, 15-ish.
The first time they were sort of seen as a unicorn, that deal?
No. This was when Blackstone first invested in VTS, probably like a $30 million valuation for the business or thereabouts. Okay. And when they invested, it was obviously huge news. This, Blackstone, the largest capital allocator to the real estate sector, is playing kingmaker for this early stage tech company. And so I approached Blackstone and I said, hey, I'm interested in this deal. Why don't you do this many times over? Because you have the largest portfolios of hotels, of single family homes, of office buildings. And Tyler Henritze, who was there at the time, he and I agreed to kind of explore this. Blackstone gave me a budget and I went out and I interviewed all Blackstone's portfolio companies like Hilton and Invitation Homes and all these companies. And I saw that there was this opportunity. And I was originally going to
what was the opportunity you saw, just to be clear? So when you went to interview them, and was it something they were lacking in that technological side, or there was an appetite for that sort of innovation period, but they weren't sure where they were going? What was the opportunity that was there at that point?
It's everything you just said. So it's one, that they were lacking in technological competence, but there was a lot of low-hanging fruit around where you could deploy technology to make their businesses better. Number two, they were not very good at doing venture on their own, or they weren't doing it at all. And number three, there was this kind of there was this duplicative effort dynamic where they were all looking at the same problems from scratch, right? So like they all had the same pain points and they were all trying to solve them without a single consolidated solution. And so that's where the kernel of the idea for Fifth Wall, which was to bring in these large institutional real estate owners into the same fund, started. As I was like, oh, well, they're already in Blackstone. And so I had the ambition to do it, within Blackstone. For a whole bunch of reasons, it didn't work out. But I structured it so that I ended up kind of getting a lot of the IP on the other side of that. And then I was like, well, I'm just going to do this on my own. And then obviously Brad came on board around then, and we set out to meet these kind of large non-Blackstone real estate companies with the same thesis. So I almost feel like that prehistory is just useful context because I was coming in with that. Yeah. But in terms of the first interactions with them, it was, we believe tech is going to change it. Well, I'd say there's three reactions, actually. Let me break that down to start, because I have to refresh my memory of what it was like in 2016 pitching. Reaction one, which we got from a lot of owners, was like, we're a real estate company, we shouldn't do tech. And there were a lot of very large real estate companies that just had that point of view, probably the majority of them. The second group had a point of view that we already do this. We already do venture capital. We're already really good at this. And what that typically meant is like the person around the office who like knew Facebook the most was battlefield promoted to being a venture capitalist, a month before. So it was like people that have no business being venture capitalists were venture capitalists at real estate companies or real estate family offices. That was kind of category two. And then category three, which there were very few of, was real estate owners who were self-aware. We said, we need to do tech. We see tech as a big opportunity. We know we can't do it ourselves, so we're kind of looking for a solution. And there were 7 of them in our first fund. Like I remember Stuart Miller at Lennar, CEO of Lennar, when we flew down to Miami to present to him, he was like, I was waiting for, a guy to come down here and present this. I was waiting for someone to have this idea, but we've been looking for a solution like this. Art Coppola at Macerich, Prologis and Hamid, they all wanted a outsourced solution to doing venture capital, but nothing like that really existed. Now, you brought up a separate point around doing it later stage. I wouldn't really call it later stage, because our first fund was $212 million. My view was actually to do it more at like the Series A stage, in which case you needed hundreds of millions of dollars. That was always my view, which is like, you can't really be a Series A investor unless you're managing, a lot of money. Yeah. And so I think the big innovation the big insight that I brought to those first conversations was, I was like, this is not like you're going to write me $1 million check and I'm going to go do this. I'm going to need significant amounts of capital to do this well, and to hire a team and to have the infrastructure to do this well. And that probably looks closer to $20 million than $1 million. I think that was original, because I don't think anyone was coming at the problem like that. But
it was original, and that's probably why in my brain, and again, it is difficult to have that retrospective, because at the time, I remember some of the funds. 20 million was a decent sized fund, and they were all at really early stage, investing sort of pre-seed and maybe at seed Series A but there wasn't anybody with that sort of, we're going to go a little bit later down the line. Yeah. With the money that was needed to do it. So that I think is probably where I'm coming from. But I just want to pick up on something. And by the way, the Lennar team, I remember meeting them actually at MIPIM in Cannes quite a few years back now. Yeah. And I remember how on point they were, and how they were one of the few real estate firms that I genuinely saw had what I would call an ambidextrous strategy of looking at the sort of the short term. Let's make sure we look after our existing business model, but we need to be looking 20, 30 years hence. I was super impressed with those guys. They were really, really clever. But you mentioned there about that they've been waiting for this sort of outsourced venture strategy. Why do you feel, as part of their innovation perspectives and strategies, that they felt more comfortable with an outsourced strategy rather than doing it themselves? Because that's what I'm still trying to get a little bit to the bottom of, and I'll tell you the reason why. So, for example, you have the, JLL as the example back in 2016-17 with Christian Ulrich, who set up obviously the Spark side. They were one of the few examples I've seen where they decided they would take it more on themselves than outsource. Mm-hmm. So why do you think they did it, and what do you feel are the advantages and disadvantages of doing something like that?
I don't really, to be honest, I don't really know what the advantages are of doing it in-house. As someone who's looked very closely at the space, I know that it's a product I compete with, or it's an approach I compete with, but the financial performance of venture capital done in-house at any company is abysmal. That's probably the most commonly recognized feature of corporate venture capital, is that the performance is horrible. The performance in the real estate industry, including some of the folks you just named, is really bad, right? They've just not been able to generate strong financial returns. And the challenge becomes that it's not just about generating financial returns. It's also about generating strategic value and insight and all of that. But if you don't generate financial returns, you can't do that either. Meaning the most strategic deals tend to be the highest performing financial deals. And that's the case with Fifth Wall. It's the case with every fund out there. And so I think in answer to your question, what Stuart Miller or what CBRE or what Prologis or what Equity Residential was looking for was, they were looking for a third-party fund because they knew the third-party fund had the potential to be high performing and high octane, and had the potential to hire people that they would not. And I think, honestly, if you look at, for example, the performance of like Fifth Wall versus the performance of any corporate venture fund, even the corporate venture that Lennar's done on its own, if you were to compare those things, you'd see that difference quite starkly. And so that, I do think, was obvious to a lot of leaders even then. It's more obvious now, and our consortium has grown as a result, but it was obvious even then, before we even had a track record, that that would be the case.
So do you think that the motivations for joining the subsequent funds differed from Fund 1? So you had 7 people in Fund 1, and over time, obviously, you've got many, many, many more LPs that have come on board. Have you seen the attitude by leadership now shift?
No, not really, actually. I would say it's more just been a couple of things have changed. So going back to the original 3 types of LPs, the number of LPs who say we don't do tech, that number is now very, very low, right? It's no longer the majority. So in the past 7 years, there's been a sea change where like that archetype of real estate owner really doesn't exist anymore. The second is the DIY, the do-it-yourself approach. There's a lot fewer of those. So just by pure, not even fifth wall performing well, just the market moving, a significant portion of the real estate industry has come around to doing tech and come around to not doing it themselves. That just happened independent of fifth wall. Not sure why balloons are flying.
That's the first. I've never seen that before. That's cool.
But that kind of happened. Then I think at the same time, fifth wall was able to demonstrate 2 things: financial performance and strategic value to our LPs. Once we did that, we were validated, but then you started to get this kind of network effect, which is like, we kind of became the firm that it was just easier to be a part of because everyone in the real estate industry started to join it. So for example, Lennar was in Fund 1, and then in Fund 2, we had Lennar, D.R. Horton, Pulte, and Toll Brothers. So 4 of the top 5 largest US home builders. And then by the 3rd fund, we had all of those plus Invitation Homes, plus American Homes for Rent, plus Meritage. So we were able to grow the consortium so dramatically that it just became the fund that everyone wanted to opt into. So there was both things driving it. I would say our performance, but also the kind of distribution gravity and brand gravity we had built around this particular model also helped.
Yeah, I certainly agree with that for sure. So taking that on a level in terms of that sort of progression, and I suppose this is I'm really interested in the answer on this, because every single person I've talked to about corporate innovation strategy, when I talk to them about why are they investing in funds, what's the purpose of that? Not one person ever mentions about getting a financial return from the money that they put in. And I find that really fascinating from a leadership perspective, that it's more about the strategic insights and actually the network that are created from the funds in terms of creating almost like a little society of great people that is about to share ideas. Is that a fair thing for me to say, that it's becoming less about the financial investment and more about the opportunities that funds create? Or am I looking at it that maybe the people that I have talked to about this are not the people who are putting their reputation and the money of the firm on the line?
I think I mean, I wouldn't say you're 100% right, but you're also not 100% wrong. I think there's definitely LPs. For real estate owners, the strategic value of investing in a fund like Fifth Wall is far more important than it is for 99.9% of the other LPs and other venture capital funds.
Yeah.
I think it would be too far a stretch to say in that same breath that they do not care about financial performance, because they do care about financial performance. It's just less important than it otherwise would be to them. So it's important that the funds identify great, companies to partner with. It's important that they, obviously identify market-leading businesses. And if you don't do that, how can you generate strategic value anyway, right? Like, if you're not in the highest performing companies, how are you possibly going to generate strategic value? So I do think it's probably an overstatement to say that financial performance is not important at all. I'm not sure you said that.
No, I don't think. I mean, obviously, it's got to be important, but it's just no one ever mentions it.
Yeah,
and I don't know if that is an element of the, the fact that this isn't a short quick investment return, and they are expecting this is going to be a return over a period of 10 plus years, because that's the fund length. So they're not even thinking about it, and actually the value is on the strategic insight in the meantime. Maybe that's what it's. Maybe that's what it is. By the way, I love the fact that you seem to be getting these little bubbles around your head in terms of things which I have no control of. I don't even know where they're coming from.
I'm triggering a lot of like emojis, I guess, on my screen.
From nowhere, because it's not like we're even live within the system. We might be on LinkedIn, but that's like separate. And I'm in the pitch black because obviously everyone's gone home. So I'm in an office, obviously with motion sensors, which mean I'm probably going to be thrown out any minute. But let's just move that forward in terms of there's two things I'm interested in. One is a fifth wall perspective, and one is a narrative that you're definitely putting out there. So one is the move, I suppose, for the fund of funds side that you've gone on. And I'm interested in that as a narrative for the funding cycle, because what I'm hearing about in probably the slightly smaller funds is that capital allocation and capital raising is really difficult at the moment from the real estate market. And I'm just interested in if that it probably isn't something that you've necessarily found because you're at a slightly different level, but is that a real challenge at the moment? Because I think that might have a knock-on effect on the earlier stage startups at the moment if the venture vehicles aren't capital raising particularly good either.
I would say it has to be true. I wouldn't say we've seen it. We raised our funds. We closed our most recent funds, so we still have a lot of dry powder in those funds. So probably a little less exposed to, how the markets are from a capital raising for VC perspective. It would shock me if they're not worse than it was 3 years ago, because how could it possibly get anything but worse? It was very easy to raise money like 3 years ago.
Yeah, I think there's a real symbiosis in terms of the struggles I'm hearing some VC funds actually capital raising, and also there does seem to be a trend at the moment, especially for some of the larger, more global companies, to actually be ridding themselves of innovation departments entirely. I've got at least 2 or 3 different large global businesses who've actually completely disbanded innovation teams.
Wow.
Is that something similar that you're hearing about or seeing, or maybe it's just isolated?
I've not. So I would say the venture fund, it being challenging to raise, capital for venture funds, that strikes me as true, although I'll be able to tell you more in 12 months, right, as to whether that's truly our experience. On shutting down innovation departments, no, I have not seen that. I haven't seen the kind of, we saw probably during, I guess, 2017 to 2020, this like explosion of job titles: chief innovation officer, chief digital officer, chief transformation, like that was crazy. So that's definitely not happening. What I'm not seeing is a contraction, which I think is what you were suggesting at those 2 companies. I'm not seeing the, oh my gosh, there's a new innovation program at this company and that company. That was the case like 5 years ago. That, no, I'm not seeing, but we're also not seeing it go the other way, at least yet.
I'm certainly seeing innovation, as you say, not being recruited for. And I can say that from personal experience, having looked at the industry when I stepped back from Unisu to say, look, I want to go in and put my money where my mouth is and actually go and join as a head of innovation and drive change from within.
Yeah.
And it was there. The limitations were there. No one was recruiting. If they were recruiting, they were very junior positions. And quite frankly, that wasn't of interest because I wanted global and I wanted, significant senior influence, but it simply wasn't there. But what I am seeing is a continued and sustained look at the sustainability argument.
Yeah.
Sustainability coming on, and actually sustainability teams, which speaks to that element of what you and I discussed earlier about that being a real driver for the changes that are happening at a technological level in real estate. So that probably comes on to that next question I want to ask about. You're talking a lot about, obviously, and this comes with Fifth Wall, with your move into the climate tech space, and you're talking a lot about climate tech being subsumed by prop tech. So just talk to me a little bit about that, because I think I agree with you. I'd just like to hear sort of that narrative from you, just so I can understand it a little bit.
I think so. Obviously we built our business in a somewhat bifurcated way between what we traditionally thought of as prop tech, which is software for the real estate industry, And we have a number of funds in that space. And then it was really around 2018, 19 that I started to focus on this opportunity in climate. And climate was conceptualized, and probably still is conceptualized, as a different approach to investing than venture. Even though that's probably only a half-truth, that's how a lot of LPs see it. They see investing in the energy transition as a different thing than doing traditional venture. That's just, I don't make the rules. That's how LPs kind of see it. Now, we therefore built a fund, our climate fund, which was expressly focused on everything around the energy transition, but with Fifth Wall's model of bringing in corporate LPs and focusing on this particular sector. That was kind of the core of that strategy. We've got, $800 million in that particular strategy. What we've seen is that now that the funds are operational, the bright line between where prop tech ends and climate tech begins, it's not even that it's blurry, it's that even as someone in the space, it's very hard to find that line or to draw that line, because the practicality of lowering costs or driving incremental revenue, and that sustainability and energy savings and renewable energy and on-premise energy storage and building electrification, those go hand in hand. Like you actually have to solve those two things together. And so the number of instances where you're having pure play prop tech opportunities and pure play climate tech opportunities is getting so narrow and so small that it just doesn't make sense to not subsume one in the other. Now, for simplicity's sake, I'm saying, prop tech basically becomes the kind of catch-all phrase to be inclusive of climate tech for the real estate industry. I think you could also make a different argument the other way. I think the reason I'm saying that is that our focus remains the real estate industry, the construction industry, the hospitality industry. We're not shifting to the energy industry. I think if you were talking to a VC in the energy industry, they'd say the opposite. They'd say, well, prop tech is becoming part of, energy tech or climate tech.
Yeah,
so yeah. I'm a little bit biased in saying that I think prop tech is just going to be inclusive of hardware, software, renewable energy, materials, technology, data and analytics, AI, all of that is going to be prop tech.
Yeah, and I can't disagree in any way. I mean, that's when we first built the classification of what prop tech is and what prop tech isn't, when we were classifying all the prop tech startups in the world, it was trying to convince people to realize that construction technology wasn't its own entity. It was actually sitting under the umbrella of prop tech. And until that point, no one had really thought about it. It was two entirely separate sectors, and I disagreed entirely. But speaking of the climate tech, perhaps getting a little bit more specific on this, because with a role that is about to be announced in due course, I've now gone into that area, and hallelujah, I've got light. I'm now quite interested in that sustainability argument. Where do you think the biggest challenges the industry faces at the moment? If you're a leader of a global, let's talk about global real estate firm, what do you feel the biggest challenges facing them on the climate tech discussion is? Because I have a view, but I'd love, and I'll share that with you afterwards in terms of what I'm seeing in certain areas of the world, but you've got much better visibility than I on this one. Yeah,
so I want to make sure I answer the question correctly. The biggest challenge for whom? For real estate CEOs?
Yeah, correct.
I think they have two. One is straightforward, which is, I think it's the thing that obviously we focus on, which is how do we provide a lens, an aperture for real estate companies to get access to all of these, great climate tech businesses that could, help them generate revenue or generate EV charging revenue or, save energy with, smarter, better HVAC systems, glass, motors, etc. The other part of it is, I think, being aware of how nasty the stick is with a little more financial precision. This is not really Fifth Wall's role to do, so we've only done this, I would say, in a casual, offhanded way, but the amount of fines that the real estate industry is about to pay to cities that are related to energy efficiency, carbon fines, carbon taxes, carbon neutrality laws, is going to be staggering, like absolutely staggering. Like we're probably talking about the destruction of trillions of dollars of enterprise value vis-a-vis fines over the course of the next 20 years. And it's in a weird parallel to the climate crisis itself and how it's going to make certain parts of the world unlivable. It seems like this is a specter that's like in plain sight, obvious and inevitable, but for some reason, everyone's just talking around it. And it's a bit confusing to me.
I mean, can I challenge you and say that it's probably confusing to them too? I mean, it's so in plain sight that they still can't quite grasp what they are responsible for. And that's one of my big worries at the moment, which is the real estate leaders seem to be burying their head in the sand a little bit about what their responsibility is.
And I have no doubt that regulators haven't made their lives any easier by making these complicated laws and exposing it to lots of political polarization, all of that. I totally get that. It's just like, if you're an allocator, let's say you're a major allocator to the real estate industry, the US real estate industry on the capital side, and I were to just tell you, hey, an alien is going to come down from space in the year 2040, and they're going to reach down and they're going to take $8 trillion of value from real estate in the US. Shouldn't right now, as a long-term allocator, you be doing everything to understand that $8 trillion number, where it's going to happen, how it's going to happen, how bad it's going to be. It's going to be worse in some places than others. Like, we know that. Like, to be clear, that scenario I just painted of that alien or Godzilla from space destroying $8 trillion of value, that is a certainty that is happening. And yet no one knows if it's 2030 or $8 trillion, but it's staggering. And so my answer to your question is, what is holding the real estate industry back is, I think, the avoidance of a precise estimate of how much value is going to be destroyed by virtue of decarbonization and or carbon neutrality laws and fines, because they are two sides of the same coin. You're either going to pay it to the government or you're going to pay it to fix your buildings. And that is somewhat baffling to me, right?
Yeah, no, I'm with you. Funnily enough, you used your analogy of the carrot and the stick just then, and I was emceeing a conference in Hong Kong about, in fact, just before Christmas, and we used exactly that analogy in terms of the ESG challenges that are facing the industry. And I actually asked that exact question. I don't know if you know, Akina Ho's just taken up a venture partner position at Pi Labs, and I said, what's your opinion? Is it stick or carrot that we need with the industry? And she just went, we are going to get so much stick about to whack the heads of every single real estate leader in the world that we will not fail to understand the laws within sort of a 2 to 5 year period, because there's going to be, exactly as you said, the fines which will come out in this industry will be significant.
Yeah.
And actually, the biggest concern that I've got at the moment is around the types of different emissions which are hanging around the industry, and the lack of understanding of the responsibilities the industry faces, in particular around, for example, Scope 3 emissions, and not knowing what they are responsible for within the supply chain, of which the real estate industry supply chain is so vast that I don't think they've got a handle on what they've got, where they've got it, and how they're going to measure it, let alone analyze and reduce it. And if I was a real estate leader at the moment, I'd be having serious sleepless nights trying to understand what the hell I've got to do. So I think it's a really interesting time, and we'll see what's going to happen in the future. Brendan, I know we haven't got a lot of time because I'm sure you're going to get pulled off any second, but just two quick ones for me, really, just to finish off, I suppose. There are very, very few people in the real estate world who understand the global market. I think there's almost a handful, really. So I'm just really interested for you on your opinions on the sort of geographical markets. Where are you quite excited by at the moment in terms of the opportunities from a venture perspective, not necessarily from anything else, but where do you see the opportunities at the moment globally for the opportunities for you to do really well in Fifth Wall? And by the way, I see, because obviously you're out in the Middle East an awful lot, for example. So is that where the opportunities are, or do you see it elsewhere?
The opportunities, I mean, and I say this as someone who has always been optimistic about the internationalization of venture capital markets and growth equity markets. Nonetheless, despite my optimism, the opportunity set is broadly most concentrated in North America. It has been the whole time we've been running Fifth Wall. I'm not sure that the percentage of value has changed nearly at the pace that I would like. We, of course, have always been optimistic about Europe. We have a whole European strategy that's expressly focused on Europe. We have ambitions of doing something similar in Asia and the Middle East, but the opportunity set just isn't as significant there. And I would say the growth has been more tepid than I would have liked. So my honest answer is this is like still 80–85% of the opportunity resides in North America. And that's from an innovation perspective. From a demand perspective, we've seen globalization happening at an even faster rate than we anticipated. So the complexion of Fifth Wall's LP base is far more international than when we started the firm, or even I would have anticipated 5 years ago. So a little bit of a kind of conflicting answer there. Tech is still very much concentrated in North America, but demand is more global than I anticipated.
Yeah, and I think that's entirely fair enough. Entirely fair. So last question, in terms of, there is a lot of hype around AI. Do you share in the hype, or do you feel there are other opportunities that are perhaps sort of just under the radar at the moment, which is where your excitement lies?
No, I think AI, there's every reason to think AI will change every aspect of our lives. I think it will just change it on a slower time frame than people want to believe. And which is probably a universal truism of everything in technology, and probably a good axiom to keep in mind when it comes to any innovation, and especially with prop tech. Change happens very slowly. And when change happens very slowly, when you're just talking about inorganic things, once you start talking about organic things like you and me, James, and people at organizations, so now organic matter, change happens even slower. So AI is going to have, because it's definitionally interacting with human intelligence, organic things, it is going to happen profoundly but slowly over the next, I think, decades. So I'm very bullish on the opportunity. We're very bullish on the application layers that can be built for the real estate industry. But I would say I'm bearish on people that think that, you and me, James, are going to be killed off by cyborg terminators in, the next 5 years. It's not something I stay up at night thinking about, nor am I worried about.
Yeah. Entirely fair, which is the classic Amara's law. So we underestimate change in the we underestimate change in the long term, but we overestimate in the short term. So
exactly. I think that's exactly right.
Yeah, very apt place to finish. So I'm going to stop the live stream, but thank you publicly for being on, Brendan. Stick on for 2 seconds while it's ending.